Welcome, listeners, to Snippit Sports Science Podcast, sponsored by EliteForm.com. The article we're doing today is Effects of Passive Heat Intervention on Muscle Hypertrophy and Neuromuscular Function, a systematic review with meta-analysis by Patrick Rodriguez and colleagues. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm well. Happy New Year to you, Jared.
Oh, Happy New Year. Happy New Year, listeners.
This article actually comes out of the Queensland University of Technology. There's a lot of authors in there that are very familiar to both of us, one being one of your supervisors on your thesis. Yeah, know some people who know some people.
Yeah, I might know some people. Possible conflict of interest on this, everyone.
So why did you choose this one, Jared? Let's get into that.
So actually, my supervisors sent this one to me. I wasn't aware of it myself originally, and so I'm quite thankful to them for sending it to me. So one of my supervisors, Jeff Manette, is actually on this paper and had a read of it as part of my literature review, and quite a good study, really.
Yeah, it's a really good analysis. It's quite nice and punchy. So onto the paper. In respect to passive heating, it's actually been used as a therapeutic administration as part of various cardiovascular, metabolic, oncological, and other health treatments. Targeting skeletal muscle, localized heat application is used in post-exercise recovery and the rehabilitation of sports-related soft tissue injuries, and this may promote adaptations to training loads and heat-induced preconditioning effects to protect against subsequent damage. There's also a potential to use passive heatants for its exercise mimetic properties, with reports of acute, medium-term, and chronic benefits. And I definitely know as a strength coach that I employ the use of a sauna post-strength training, even though we're in the middle of our hot summer in Queensland, Australia. When we think of passive heating methods, which use different temperatures and exposure times, this can be looked at using low temperature applications, such as less than 41 degrees, applied for about 60 minutes, which can be shown to increase blood flow and metabolic rates. A series of molecular events associated with muscle growth also occur during physiological hypothermia. Passive heating reports changes in gene expression, anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects, mitochondrial biogenesis, heat shock proteins expression, we talk a lot about heat shock proteins, and also inhibits atrophy by inducing a reduction in mitochondrial oxidative capacity. Moreover, increases in wet muscle mass and protein content in animal soleus muscle has been shown to be reported after one 60-minute passive heat session. And this suggests that passive heating can promote cell proliferation and induce muscular hypertrophy.
So if passive heating can stimulate muscle hypertrophy, it's possible that passive heating could also increase muscle strength. So a researcher that subscribers to the podcast will be familiar with, Godot and colleagues, they demonstrated that a 6% increase in human knee extensor isometric maximal voluntary contraction torque after 10-week passive heating intervention. Further, passive heat acclimation has been evidenced to augment skeletal muscle contractility. Despite this potential improvement in muscle strength, it is still unclear whether passive heating may evoke adaptations in both central and peripheral contributions to muscle performance. According to Littman and Shields, passive heating may serve as an adjunct strategy to trigger systemic stressor to adapt to central nervous system responsiveness. An acute passive heating session can increase motor cortical excitability measured via transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it might be an effective intervention to enhance movement control and learning.
Rolling on to the methods, the inclusion criteria included, firstly, original papers examining passive heating. Second, healthy animals or adult humans, so greater than 18 years of age. Thirdly, included a control group or a control condition. And the exclusion criteria included review papers, combinations of passive heating with active heating, such as exercise, use of passive heating as a recovery or protective strategy for exercise or sport, did not control the intensity, such as the temperature of the passive heating, and measured the primary outcomes during hypothermia, absence of any targeted primary outcome variable, and the experiments in tissues and cells. The primary outcomes considered during the search, in which the article or the analysis we will go through, were firstly neuromuscular performance, such as muscle strength, power, motor invoked potential by nerve and or transcranial magnetic stimulation. Secondly, muscle hypertrophy, e.g. cross-sectional area, muscle volume, muscle size and or mass. And thirdly, adverse effects of heat stress on neuromuscular performance, muscle hypertrophy, or health. So they're really important things for us, I think, in that applied setting to able to highlight that. So it kind of actually gets into the meat and tells us if it actually has any benefit for us as coaches or as applied sports scientists. And the secondary outcomes considered included muscle temperature, core temperature, skin temperature, thermal sensation and or comfort, heart rate, and lastly, blood pressure.
Just a couple of notes on the studies included. So I got 8 original articles, and 5 of these studies used animals, whereas only 3 of them reported human data. So the majority of the data we're going to be talking about is actually from animal samples, and that's just a limitation of this field, that we're quite limited in the research that has been done, and so we do need to rely on some animal data. Also, from the human studies, only 1 of the 3 used a mixed sample of male and female participants, whereas 2 of the studies used male participants only. So we are continuing to see a very strong male participant bias in sports science, and it's something we still need to be working on.
Regarding the passive heating methods, 2 studies applied a heating pad or heat or steam generating sheet, 4 used an environmental chamber, and 2 studies administered hot water immersion. An acute passive heating session was investigated in 6 studies, and chronic intervention was applied in 2 studies, which one was 30 days and the other one was 10 weeks. The intensity of the passive heating varied from 34 to around 42 degrees Celsius, and some studies controlled this intensity during the intervention via muscle temperature or core temperature regulation. The duration of the passive heating intervention was varied, ranging from 15, 30, 60 minutes, 2 hours, and 8 hours in length.
Moving into the results now. The acute studies showed no changes in overall muscle mass 1 day after passive heating. However, increases in wet muscle mass, dry muscle mass, relative wet muscle mass, and overall wet muscle mass were apparent 7 days after passive heating, so it could take a little bit of time. The chronic studies showed that after 30 days of continuous passive heating, male rats experienced greater relative wet muscle mass than the control group, 16%. Similarly, Goto and colleagues observed increases in the cross-sectional area of human quadriceps muscles after exposure to 10 weeks of localized passive heating to the upper leg that were otherwise absent in a non-heated leg.
Just quickly before you go on here, if anyone's wondering what the difference between wet and dry muscle mass, when you look at it, removed whole muscle weight is presented as wet muscle mass and relative wet muscle mass. So that's wet muscle mass divided by total body mass. The protein content of dissected muscle is presented as dry muscle mass and relative. So it's divided by body mass. So that's just probably one way of sort of when we talk about wet or dry, what's the difference there? So protein content versus the whole muscle weight.
Shall we move into the discussion? What did you see there, Chris?
Well, when we look at the muscle hypertrophy with respect to the acute findings, nothing really happened after 1 day, but after 7 days of exposure to passive heating, the meta-analysis demonstrated an increase in the muscle mass. So that shows that it needs to have some form of longitudinal or short-term multiple applications. With respect to the author's knowledge, the molecular mechanisms responsible for this increase in muscle mass only 7 days after passive heating hasn't been fully elucidated. However, it could be assumed that some of the purported mechanisms governing these effects include heat shock and enzymatic proteins and subsequent inflammatory cascade associated with muscle growth and activation of the AKT-mTOR pathways.
Right, I don't think anyone would expect hypertrophy after 1 day. That would be absurd. You would need at least 7 days to have a response, a physiological response of any sort of regrowth or regeneration.
That's exactly right. So I think really what they're just trying to do is they're trying to extrapolate some other pathways which could be potentially activated after a longitudinally type approach, but they show that those type of pathways are activated during high load resistance training and also blood flow restriction, and in other heat studies, and perhaps not that exposed in, or perhaps not the ones that were in these meta-analysis, have actually shown like heat shock proteins to actually been activated after some form of increased environmental heat.
Right, and they go into quite a bit of detail about the different potential molecular mechanisms there, but I think we can move into the chronic findings regarding hypertrophy. And there were only 2 studies included here. Nevertheless, both studies reported a statistical increase in muscle mass after a long-term passive heating exposure without any exercise training or other interventions. These results and the data from the meta-analysis point to passive heating as a possible alternative for people with low muscle mass and that are not able to exercise. That said, the issues relating to the heterogeneity of and risk of bias in the data must be addressed in future work before this intervention can be confidently prescribed.
Obviously, a very generic disclaimer there at the end, but I think it really does bring a good point there that in some bodies or populations, whether it's athletes or whether it's actually Gen Pop, as it says there, who people with low muscle mass or unable to exercise, I think we need to be open to these kind of concepts to be able to make these changes. For example, if you want to amplify your changes with Gen Pop who can't exercise, do you add BFR and heat? Is that another potential intervention for these type of people in populations?
Yeah, those are excellent points.
Moving on to the measurements of neuromuscular function, which perhaps has a lot of application to a lot of strength coaches out there. With respect to the acute findings here, an acute rise in muscle temperature achieved via passive heating within the physiological range, 34 to 42 degrees Celsius, increases muscle contractility, strength, and power in a dose response at about a rate of 2 to 5% per increments of 1 degree Celsius. In contrast, however, the studies included in the systematic review did not find any changes in muscle strength or power after a single bout of passive heating. This is likely explained by muscle strength and power measurements occurring after cooling. Other evidence has shown that hypothermia caused by passive heating negatively affects central neuromuscular activation, causing fatigue. And that's something that we've always got to be considerate about, is that you've got to make sure that the total heat stimulus is not too fatiguing. Notably, increases in motor cortical excitability have been reported after cooling when core temperature returns to normal values, suggesting a possible supercompensatory response to passive heating and the potential for chronic neuromuscular adaptations, repeated exposures.
Going into the chronic findings, other studies in this review demonstrate that muscle strength and electrically evoked contractions were increased after a long-term exposure to passive heating, 10 weeks and 30 days respectively. These outcomes reaffirm the conclusions of Rassanet, Wilson, and Perriard, who reported an increase in electrically evoked peak twitch amplitude on relaxed muscle and maximal voluntary contraction torque production after a medium-term passive heating exposure, 11-day intervention, 1 hour per day. These observations, therefore, suggest that chronic passive heating intervention can generate improvement of isometric force and muscle activation, which could be used as a potential strategy of exercise mimetics.
Overall here, Jared, I'm starting to get that real feeling that, as we've said a few times in this podcast already, that acutely it may have effects, but not really. It's more so when you have it over a chronic or a longitudinal type program that you'll actually start to see some sort of benefits. And we're talking about passive heating, of course. Most people that we're working with, we would actually have some form of active exercise intertwined with it, wouldn't we?
Yes, I think there's different applications for passive versus active heating. Heating during being passive and heating during being active. Because I think passive and active heating would be a potentially different thing, but within this context.
So overall, Jared, what was your thoughts about this paper and how it fits into your thesis, but also just how it fits into, our roles of coaches and also applied sports scientists?
Yeah, I think it mostly just gives a bit of context into what are the effects of heat alone, whereas because usually we would be applying heat with exercise at the same time. And so it almost just gives a little bit more of a background of what are the effects directly from the heat.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's important to know because sometimes we just want to be adding exercise into something and saying, well, what happens when we do this with it, as opposed to almost stripping it back and just taking it back to the simplicity of just passive heating alone.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Did you have any other thoughts on it?
Well, I think I pretty much covered it there. It is actually nice just to go back to, I guess, I wouldn't say it's necessarily how it all originates, but what happens when you just apply just passive heating, and it does give me thoughts about, say, in that rehab setting, or in terms of, say, Gen Pop, into certain populations where to be open to using passive heating in between sessions in that rehab type sense, or potentially, is that step one? We just apply heat. Let's keep it really simple. And then once we're actually gaining a little bit more function, do we go into step 2, 3, and 4? These are really interesting, these studies for me, because I'm delving so much into high level activity that it's good to see where we potentially could get small little gains elsewhere by just sitting there doing nothing.
Excellent thoughts. Thanks for that, Chris. And thank you, listeners. Please tune in 2 weeks for the next snippet. Remember to subscribe to the podcast so you get a notification about that. And please visit our sponsor at eliteform.com.